Yeah, so hello everyone. If you're new to LCOC, my name's Asia and I'm president. If you've been with us since we were founded early this year, welcome back to our first academic speaker event of the year. In the past, we've been honoured to host Dr. Nandini Pandey and Dr. Feroz Vasunia, who have both given really fascinating talks, and I'm really excited for Bet to give her own this evening. This academic year, we're really excited to bring back our usual group of events, academic, welfare and social. LCOC remains firm in its goal to educate students about the connections between classics and race and to create a network for students across London. This year, however, our aim to aid the movement to decolonise will take a more intensified approach as we hope to start and support an open dialogue between students and departments across UOL. So in order to do this, we have hired student reps from across Royal Holloway, KCL, UCL and LSE who will be helping us throughout the year, and this will hopefully culminate in a co-written letter to UOL Classics departments signed from students across London, urging them to take more action and help us to facilitate real change. We do all of this work for free, and all of our events so far have also been free. So if you'd like to support us in any way, please feel free to donate anything using links that I will post in the chat. Most importantly, we hope to keep growing the incredible, supportive and inclusive community we have nurtured since our conception. Every single person who has attended our events, every academic who has spoken for us, and every person on the committee has helped me and others grow into better classicists. Classicists whose boundaries are not limited by traditional concepts and ideas, but those who take up and believe in critical and radical readings and interpretations. And I'm sure this talk will further broaden these horizons. The structure of the event will be as follows. Bet's going to speak for around 30 minutes, and then at the end we'll have time for a Q&A. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat at any point during the talk, or you can just use the chat generally to comment and share resources. And we always take a list of all the resources shared and publicize it after our events. Also, this event will be closed captioned to allow for wider accessibility, so feel free to switch it on if you'd like to use this feature. For me, it's kind of included on the bar at the bottom as live transcript, but please let us know if you have any issues turning on the captions. As you can tell, it's also being recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube for public consumption, so please turn off your videos if you don't wish to be on screen. Before I hand over to Natasha, who's our academic events officer, I just want to reiterate our zero tolerance policy. We are totally committed to creating a safe and welcoming space for every single member, and therefore we will never tolerate any comments or participation that does not contribute to the well-being of our communal space. So yeah, over to you now, Tash.
Hi everyone, lovely to see a good turnout, especially for an event on Zoom. I'm sure plenty of people have got Zoom fatigue over the last year. Yeah, we're very pleased to have Bet Hucks as our first speaker this term. Bet's currently undertaking her PhD broadly in classics and Egyptology at Heidelberg University, and her research focuses specifically on archaeology, Egypt, and race within the ancient world. Her talk today will focus on the experience of being a BIPOC archaeologist within Egyptology, and ways in which we can try and improve equity within the classroom and where classics is taught, but also out in the field, for example, in archaeological excavations. Bet's a really strong advocate for increasing access to marginalized students in ancient Mediterranean studies. And for example, she's part of the Committee for Sport Chile Europe, which is a mutual aid network offering microgrants to students and early career researchers who have financial need in classics. So we're immensely pleased to have her as our speaker today, as somebody who shares our desire to make classics a more accessible place for everybody. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to Bet. If you have questions, as Asia said, please do just post them in the chat and we'll take a note of them, or feel free to raise them yourself after Bet's finished speaking. Thanks very much.
Thank you both for the lovely introduction. As everyone said, hi, my name is Bet. I publish under the name Bethany Hucks, my full name, if you happen to be looking me up. But Bet is the name I use in my daily life, so that's what I'll be using in this talk because I want it to be more informal. I am a light-skinned Black woman wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a dark blue button-down for those of you who cannot see me. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about my identity as a Black woman who does archaeology, and specifically as someone who does archaeology that is not based around their own source community. And then I'm going to follow that up with some discussion of how I use 3D models to increase equity in the classroom and access to people who don't have, who wouldn't normally have access to either to site excavations or to museum collections to help them with their research and understanding. So I use my own personal background and my identity. It heavily informs my research and my perspective. I'm looking at the way that Romans use and incorporate Egyptian and Egyptian style iconography and stylistic elements, materials, imported goods.
It's right there. It's on a pile of books.
Into their own practices within Rome and the surrounding areas over the course of the 1st through the 3rd century CE. So some of those places are temples and very public spaces, and some of them are private homes. So I think a lot, I use my identity a lot as a person who lives in a community far from home. I'm a Black American, like I said. I live mostly in Italy, but sometimes in Germany by virtue of where I'm doing my PhD. And I use that to think about how it feels to be visibly different from the people that you are living and working around, to be working in the 2nd or 3rd language, to be conducting all of your administrative life in one language, and to be conducting your personal life in another. Things that I have not seen done a lot in transcultural studies. And part of that is because of those experiences, it's really positive for especially BIPOC archaeologists to be able to bring new perspectives into research and to amplify our knowledge of the ancient world in different ways. My experiences as a Black archaeologist in fieldwork are sometimes difficult and sometimes hysterical. I have not personally been in major danger, but I have felt like that was a possibility sometimes, depending on where I'm excavating. Particularly, I've done some excavations that are in very small towns in Europe, from the UK to Eastern Europe. I've been quite a lot of places, and I'm usually the only Black person that someone has maybe ever met before, maybe ever seen in real life before. I get followed down the street, mostly by men and children. I get marriage proposals in foreign languages, and I'm told to play along. They're such small towns that usually the person proposing is, for example, in one case, the person whose land we were excavating on. I don't think that my white colleagues who are asking me to play along really think about the emotional load that takes as I'm trying to work, go grocery shopping, etc., that they don't have to deal with. But in other cases, it's a topic of discussion where I'm not, quote unquote, just another American. I get to have discussions with people that they wouldn't necessarily have with some white. And I was specifically told, oh, it's because you're white that we get to have these discussions. So yeah, it can be positive. It can be very different if I were a man. But yeah, that's something going at archaeological excavations in places where, especially if nobody looks like you, that's something you might want to think about talking to your PI about. Have other students of color gone before? If not, why do you think that is? What do you think their experiences are? Things like that. I know it can be uncomfortable to have these conversations, but sometimes it's better to do that beforehand and get the discomfort sort of out of the way rather than learn on the fly when you get on the ground. For me, there's also a lot of both internal and external pressure to study my own source community. There's a lot of questions about why I study Egypt and Rome instead of Black America. My own source community would prefer, because there are so few of us, that we keep that knowledge and use it to discover sort of our lost history. On the flip side, if I go to a major conference in classics or Egyptology, I get a lot of white people asking me if I'm Egyptian. And then when I say no, the follow-up question is, then why are you an Egyptologist? With very little cognitive dissonance that they themselves are not Egyptian. So that can be a fun microaggression to put up with. I have yet to come up with a response that wouldn't put my career prospects in jeopardy. So if anybody has any ideas, drop those in the chat for me, please. There's also a lack of Black representation in particular, but in general, archaeologists of color, except for at the local level in the US mostly, and a little bit in Canada. So there's no one who shares my cultural background, especially as I work quite a lot abroad, which is its own mental load. Nobody speaks my dialect, so I am always in code switching mode. And my family and friends don't really understand what I do or why I'm doing it, because they don't have an education background, basically. I'm first generation college, so that can be another level to deal with. The way that I like to approach archaeology, though, is as a source for useful skills that I can use both to explain history and the world to my family and friends, but also to make myself better at other jobs that I do at my museum work. Being able to extrapolate data, being able to look at a site plan and know what I'm talking about, being able to read dirt, basically, to touch material and have an idea of when and where it comes from in the world, from a quick analysis in a museum or elsewhere, can be a really useful skill. And I try when I'm talking to students and useful. That's one of the many, because particularly in families of color or first generation families, it's really difficult to convince parents sometimes that archaeology and classics are worthwhile endeavors. So basically selling it in other ways until the kid can decide for themselves whether they like archaeology or not, or until the parents get convinced that we have worthwhile skills too. I love what I do. Every day is different. I can do creative things. I get to work with ancient objects at modern source communities. I can talk to people or avoid people. I can travel. I'm learning a whole new set of languages that I never thought that I would get the opportunity to. And I also part of the reason I stick with it is because I'd like to think that I'm sort of kicking the door open for other BIPOC archaeologists who might not have seen someone like them doing this kind of work. I've never seen anybody like me doing this kind of work outside of West Asia. So there aren't a lot of us in Europe. There aren't a lot of us in North America. I've never met another BIPOC archaeologist in real life, only in virtual conferences. So yeah, the more of us that we can sort of accumulate, that would be, hopefully we can inspire the people coming after us. That would be great. And in terms of ways to keep that door open further, one of the easiest, especially for people who don't have regular site access, which in previous years included neurodivergent people, disabled people, economically disadvantaged people, people without access to local museums or free museums, people who, especially in North America, who live over such big distances from museum spaces. But these days with COVID, I mean, everybody's working from home, so everybody can really take advantage. Well, a lot of people are working from home, not everybody, but quite a lot of students and learners who would otherwise have access to museum collections no longer do. So I use 3D models in order to give all of those people access to objects that they might not normally be able to see in more than a 2D format. The 2D format, especially as used in textbooks, I find was particularly unhelpful for me in thinking about how objects relate to people and how objects relate to spaces. So I'm going to share my screen now with a couple of notes on 3D models, if I can. I'm going to share that one and then. Okay, so what do I mean by 3D models? I mean digital reproductions of real existing or previously existing ancient things and places. This can be still images like the one on the screen. This can be 3D models that you would do like sort of a visual walkthrough that you could record for YouTube, etc., or have your students play with. Or it could be physical 3D printed models of sites and objects, reproductions of those things. Usually they're printed in a single material on a single color. And that cheapest way, you can have students paint them, or you can paint them if it's your own project, etc. And for that, it's really good to use Dungeons and Dragons paint and paintbrushes if anybody is looking to do that for themselves. So for classics, 3D models can help teach assemblages and context, how to think about placing a statue. For example, if you're looking at the back of a statue, you can look at whether it's finished, whether it's meant to be seen in the round, whether it has attachment points, whether it's been damaged and refurbished, so you won't really have any idea. You can give students ideas of more nuance in terms of objects and the scale of time periods. You can walk through places through different periods of time, and you get less of the sort of flattening of ancient history that seems to happen quite a lot when teaching by virtue of teaching such a long time span in such a short period of time usually. You can do a lot of emphasis on color and material you're not able to do in 2D pictures, which is wonderful, especially for archaeology students, but in general, for anyone who's interested in art history, the emphasis on materiality and where that material comes from can really add a new dimension that is often not covered in a lot of classrooms. And it's something that if you're doing your own research, perhaps your professors haven't necessarily, 3D models are a great way for you to access objects on your own time using your own, either your phone or your laptop. You can use pre-printed models or pre-designed models from museum collections, which are wonderful. The ones on the right here, or the ones on the next slide I'll show you are an example of something that a museum is scanning on their own that I use to look at the backs and the bottoms of canopic jars that are not normally available when you see them in museums. Beyond classics, like I mentioned, you can show STEM-oriented parents and students that classics has practical, applicable skills. And it's good for visual and tactile learners, especially people who have trouble seeing. It's really good for people with sort of motion-oriented disabilities who find fine motor movements difficult because it's harder to break them. So they can get a sense of objects and they can touch things and get a sense of texture and volume, etc., without worrying that they'll damage anything, which is really nice. And it also helps students to learn how to excavate the archive, especially now when we don't necessarily have access to physical sites to do excavations. It can provide really good opportunities for pre-doctoral publications and project funding. There's a ton of funding right now for digital humanities. There are lots of resources online about where to apply, and that goes all the way down to high school level, sort of secondary level, and even sometimes you can get like sort of school-wide initiatives, but you can do private projects as well, depending on where your funding source is. And it prepares students for a lot of different options going forward. So these are the 3D models. These are some of the ones that I've looked at. These are canopic jars. These are from a free website, and you could print them, you could rotate them and look at them in at various angles. You can compare them by size to other objects or 3D models, so you get a much better idea mentally rather than just having to look at the measurement and thinking to yourself, I think that's about this big. You can see it in comparison with actual like furniture from the excavation site, etc. It's a really useful tool that way. There are some limitations, of course. On the left is one version of King Tut's funeral mask, and on the right is another. They're done by two different users. The user on the right lists on the SketchUp website, which is one of the major websites. Oops, sorry, one of the major websites for. Oh no, sorry. One of the major websites for free 3D models is the SketchUp website, and I'm not really sure why it won't. Here we go. They offer free models of all kinds, but you have to check really on who's doing the flattening, who's doing the sort of mesh work, because you can see on the left here, the eyes are very much elongated. And if you've ever seen pictures of the real mask, you can see that the version on the right is a much more true to form version. So you do have to be careful with the fact that quite a lot of the resources are free. And they're done by volunteers. So try to look for things that as you're getting started and learning what you're doing, that are things that you are visually familiar with in a 2D format, so that you know that you're getting a good 3D version. So this is a version of a lamp where you can see that the software has done enhancement that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see from a 2D picture. Which is a really fantastic use for this kind of software. The software itself, most of it that I recommend is absolutely free. This is a page with resources, so if you're able, you can take a screenshot of that. We'll also try to put some of the links, maybe tweet out some of the links or something. for examples of how you would use 3D production in your own classroom or in your own research work, you can look on YouTube for ancient space walkthroughs. SketchUp.com is the free 3D software that's run by Google. They offer an education discount for the pro version as well. And they have a ton of tutorials on their website and on YouTube. So if you want to use other models, if you want to start creating your own, SketchUp is a really great place to start for that. There's also, if you want to start doing your own 3D models, say you have a collection at your university, or you have permission from a museum to take some pictures, or you're on an excavation site, there's a lot of free software for both iPhone and Android, where you can take a lot of pictures and combine them to create your own 3D models on phone. It can take up a bit of space on your cell phone, which is the major limitation to it. But the better quality camera that you have, the better quality 3D model that you have, or more pictures you take, the better quality 3D model that you have. And usually you just need your phone, and occasionally you need sort of small printed targets. You print 3 targets and you put them around the object, and then you take a picture of the entire thing, and your phone will use the three sort of targets to size the model properly so that it doesn't get distorted. So there are many ways for both students and professors to get involved easily in using 3D models, even just starting from providing students with options to look at these things in the classroom. And if you're a student yourself, particularly if you're someone who struggles with writing long form, this can be an option that you can approach your professors with and say, you know, I would rather, can I create a space? Can I use the data that we have to make my own 3D model, or to combine the museum 3D models to make a temporary exhibition online, or, you know, sort of different ways of using these things for your own projects that your professors might not have thought of or been aware is an easy and free option. So yes, now we have all the blank slides that I accidentally just created. So yes, that is essentially how I am using 3D models for the classics classroom. I spend a lot of time working out on my own what that free software, what the limitations of it were, et cetera. So that's why I've come up with that resource sheet, essentially, is to prevent other people from having to do that sort of work, that initial work. But it really is a low entry barrier. And particularly if your students are low income, or if, like me, they didn't have the family background to feel welcome in museums, getting students to work with digital or printed 3D models is a really wonderful opportunity. If you decide you want to print, quite a lot of universities and community colleges have 3D printers and are trying to reach out to the community to prove to schools or departments that it was a worthwhile purchase. So it can be very beneficial for you to reach out to your local community college or university and see if they have a 3D printer and would donate some materials or some printing time and a little bit of assistance. The same is also true of what are known as maker spaces. They're like little local spaces that have publicly rentable tools for very low prices. And they usually run free workshops on weekends or at night about how to use some of those tools. And most of those places these days also have 3D printers. Granted, they're on fairly small scales, but for printing things like scaling up a coin so that students can practice reading the Latin and deciphering the imagery, et cetera, or for people who have limited vision to blow up small objects, or to print several examples of things for students to pass around the classroom, is a really low cost barrier and often will be donated by people if they know that it's happening for school. And that includes 3D printing manufacturers themselves. They often need to do what are called test prints. So they will just print a random object. And if you sometimes email them, hey, can you test print this as part of your next run? Would you be willing to donate it? There are some very easy ways to get in the door. Obviously, this is more admin than a lot of people want to sign up for, is all of this sort of emailing, calling around, but it saves, it's the time versus money cost comparison, unfortunately. There are some obvious limitations in terms of, I'm gonna end my slideshow now, in terms of doing things like alt text, making things accessible for people to view things when you're doing 2D versions of it. So having to do a description of a 360-degree object or of a walkthrough within, say, an ancient Pompeian house is really difficult, and it's probably easier to record it than to type it. And in some cases, it may be impossible to add live alt text to a model where students can sort of walk around inside. So that can be problematic. But if you're going to offer something like this, or if you want your professors to offer something like this at your department, I would encourage everybody to put those as options on their syllabus. Your students who are interested in classics but maybe not sure about it because it might not lead to something, or your students who don't love writing and aren't getting into classics for language purposes might be really interested that they can do something more art historical and more digital, etc. So yeah, it has big payoffs, and it also has limitations, of course. And when you're thinking about excavating the archive and increasing access, I think that 3D models are really one of the growing fields that I think will become a huge deal in classics in the future. So even if you're not learning about it now, it's useful to know now, because students in the future will be so used to 3D printed things in a classroom in other situations that I think it will start becoming a real asset, but also a real standard in especially art classrooms. So yes, that's my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to go through and see if there are any questions in the chat so far. Feel free to drop them or to raise your hand and ask audibly.
We've got some, I should
Kendra,
say.
thank you for that suggestion.
Sorry, I was just going to say that
so I've tried that a couple of times. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say we've got a couple of questions sort of privately messaged and so on. So yeah, but although I quite liked Kendra's and Miranda's comments as well. The idea of just throwing the question back to the questioner.
Yes, so I've done that a couple of times, and for some reason people take that the wrong way. So my response is generally, oh, I really love it. How did you get into Egyptology? And they, honestly speaking, most of the time people don't like the question being turned around on themselves. They take it as aggressive, even though they're being aggressive toward me, which is why I'm looking for something. I mean, there are people who are willing to reflect, and those are not the people that are generally asking that question. So yeah, I would love to find a response that is acceptable to sort of like ready to retire older white men specifically. But yeah, I haven't come up with it yet. Okay, what are some of my favorite topics or time periods within Egyptology? Okay, so obviously, because I am interested in the period of Roman rule, that's something that I study and I'm really passionate about. But I also love the Ptolemaic period, when you're getting these like huge parades with ancient automatons that were, according to descriptions, that could drink milk or could squirt milk out at the crowds in terms of like giving people offerings. They were just trying to bribe people to worship them and love them as gods / pharaohs in really interesting ways for about 300 years that are really fun to read about. I also like to think about, I've talked about this on a podcast I did last week, but about how to move crocodiles in the ancient Mediterranean, like the people who are training them and feeding them, and how you put a crocodile on a boat, just sort of general random things like that, how you move glass from Egypt to Germany and Afghanistan, because we have a lot of examples of that. The spread of the cult of Isis throughout the Mediterranean and up into as far as London and the Hadrian's Wall. So yeah, just in general, like the interactions of movement and people, first locally within Egypt and Sudan, as we think about Egypt as a being, and then repositioning Egypt and its relationship to, say, West Africa and further to India. Like, how far does it reach? How far does it go? And the fact that there are Egyptian beads that have been found in Alaska from ancient times is just fascinating to me, ancient world transport and transportation and interactions. Sarah, that's a great question. She asks, where do you see 3D models in museums, especially when it comes to issues of artifact repatriation? So personally, I think that if source communities are asking for particular objects to be repatriated, and there's a claim there, for example, for the Benin bronzes, then I think that museums should repatriate the original object and keep the 3D models for themselves. That's my personal view on it. I also think that 3D models are a really good way of demonstrating material culture to people who love the idea of a world museum, but don't want to take part in the sort of horrendous collecting practices of the past. So if you have a local museum that wants to give people access to objects from Iraq, et cetera, rather than try and buy things off the black market, like Hobby Lobby and some other beings that we know, what they could do is, ask legitimate collections like the Iraqi National Museum for 3D model scans, or, if they're a wealthier institution, sponsor 3D model scanning at such a museum. Then they could have high quality reproductions. What they used to do in the 1800s were do cast reproductions. So there are museums of casts all over Europe. And everybody knows they're cast. Nobody thinks they're the original, but it's a really great way to study objects that are like too heavy to be moved around for temporary exhibitions, or too expensive, or get sold into private collections, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, I think there's really a place in museums for this kind of discussion. And I think it's a shame that the limits to it so far are just, it's ours now, we don't want to give it back. Or we'll give source communities the 3D models and we'll keep the originals. There's a lot more nuance for discussion there in terms of back and forth that still needs to happen, but there's a lot of potential as well that I'm hoping is possible going forward, especially as places like Egypt are now getting sort of more sponsorship. Some of that is foreign, et cetera, foreign investment, like the Japanese investment in the Grand Egyptian Museum. But as there's more sort of investment in cultural capital in places where people are interested in seeing objects that can't travel, I think that would be a really great opportunity for PhD students to work on projects like this, or even master students to work on projects like 3D scanning. It's something you could do also at the BA level as like an entire class focus if you really wanted to do something like that with your own museum, pitching that to your department in combination with a tech class could be a really interesting way of getting sort of a dual listed course on the syllabus. I'm going to answer a question that I got privately. Did I realize prior to getting involved in classics that it wasn't very diverse, or was it only apparent afterward? And did I feel sometimes isolated in that regard? And do I have safe spaces? So before I went back to school, I worked in financial marketing for about 10 years, or off and on, various other fields, but mostly financial marketing in New York. And I was often the only person of color in a lot of rooms with a lot of really wealthy white people. And I honestly thought that classics would be like similar levels to that, but I went abroad for my schooling, which means that I no longer have my source community when I go home. And that's been much more difficult, that I don't have really anybody in person to share this sort of, dealing with microaggressions, or, there's no one to speak my dialect with in my apartment, or, anywhere around here, really. So that in fact is a lot more isolating than I thought it was. I've created a Slack group for Black ancient Mediterranean and adjacent studies folks. So I at least have, sort of that, and I have the Sportula Europe board who always have my back. And there are places like London Classicists of Colour where you at least can see other faces that look like yours. Even if you don't necessarily know them well, it's nice to know y'all are out there. I'm not in London, I'm not in the UK, obviously, so I'm an even rarer species abroad. So yeah, it can be isolating. And when I feel that way, I try to Zoom call my friends and family and everything, but it is a little bit complicated because they don't really understand so yeah, it's a thing that I'm working through. But part of what I do for advocacy is really inspired by the fact that there's no one like me, and I can't, in good faith, in good conscience, let that happen to anybody else. So yeah, I just do my best to be as visible as possible and hope that one day I'll meet another archaeologist of color in person. I've met other classicists of color in person finally this year, but yeah, it's been a long couple of years. So imaging at the Manchester Museum, and what does the authentic object bring 3D models what does the authentic object bring that 3D models cannot provide, other than knowing that the original is the real thing? So the authenticity of an object, I view from two perspectives. The first is that source communities often place different importance on materials and authenticity for very different reasons than a museum would. For example, some of the Benin god statues that are wooden statues with ritualized nails, and they're meant to be oiled in ceremonially at a certain time of year, and museums leave them untouched because you're not supposed to touch them, which means the wood cracks and the spirit of the deity that's attached to that piece is essentially being mistreated daily in museums, according to source communities. From a museum's perspective, it's important to know about the materiality in terms of like, okay, where did the wood come from and what did that say about trade relations? Where did the nails come from and what does that say about manufacturing techniques, etc. So there are arguments to be made. I'm not going to say they're all of equal value because I don't believe that, on the importance of authenticity, both from the people who are interested in 3D scans and people who are not interested in 3D scans. It's a complicated topic, and unfortunately, because most of the power is in the hands of museums, quite a lot of the topic is heavily weighted in terms of publications. But yes, different ways to think about materials in that way. Do you think that 3D models could be used for building palace complexes and temple complexes? Like Karnak, or are those structures too complicated? So that is a great question. I'm actually doing this for my PhD, but I'm doing a Roman temple of Isis, and I'm trying to do as much as possible all of the wall art and reproduce the mosaics and reproduce the positioning of statues. And I'm doing this so far I've got the 2D model, which includes also things like trying to reproduce the palm tree, the placement of the palm trees faithfully, etc., because it makes a visual difference in terms of what you can see as you move around the building. Now, in terms of printing, I'm not going to print a landscape because I don't have the resources for that. What I am going to do is print the building, probably without the roof or making the roof removable, and print the objects. And my D&D crew, my Dungeons and Dragons friends, are helping me to paint the models. Because they already have all the techniques and skills and paintbrushes and things. And then I will display them in, for an actual museum exhibition. I've got a space all set up for it and everything. But also when I drop the thesis, I will also drop the models for other people to use so that hopefully other people can print them for their students. So we could do something like simultaneous exhibitions. I just think there's a better way to be doing these things than hoarding all the knowledge to ourselves. And I think it would be really cool for students to see this is how students in Egypt are thinking about where the statues would be placed versus in Rome, who are thinking about where the statues might be placed versus students in Winnipeg. It would just be a very interesting thing to have these sort of simultaneous, uploads of what students think are possible in these spaces. So the answer is no, I don't think it's too complex. Yes, it is time consuming, but it's not too complex. Yes, I mean, reproductions of artifacts and spaces and works can be really meaningful to people. I mean, there are some places where I do think 3D models are perhaps inappropriate. For example, the Buddhas, which were destroyed in Afghanistan, some people are like, oh, just make a 3D reproduction, but that wouldn't necessarily fulfill the needs of the community who were living and working and praying around those statues. Printing it out of a synthetic material is not going to carry the same emotional weight. But for things like, like the Mask of King Tut, which can no longer travel outside of Egypt, and is too expensive to reproduce in gold for most organizations, it would be a really great opportunity to print a funerary mask and to talk about ideas around showing the face of a dead person in your, in your classroom, nuance around human remains and displays and things, without having to actually deal with, the physical object itself and also the insurance risk. Let's see, what do you think about the diversity of 3D models out there for like models of lesser known artifacts or objects, and how can we encourage more diversity of 3D models? And there are more than enough models of pyramids and pantheons. And yes, I would also like to see something different. I completely agree. For instance, Manchester, the Manchester Museum is doing 3D models of all of their Roman lamps, and they're mass-produced objects made of clay, but it's the first time that someone like me who doesn't always have access to a museum collection can see these things in 3D and touch them and rotate them and think about, okay, this stamping of the same piece is obviously done later in the same mold because the mold degrades over time. You can sort of like compare lamps over time period or over place. It's a really great way to view masses of collections at a time. And the same with numismatic coins, like coins and medals. It's really nice to have the opportunity to look large scale at something that is often only drawn or depicted, like the size of a US quarter or like a pound coin. There are museums that are doing this work, but because they have to allocate resources, which is to say they need to pay someone or hire an intern whom they should also pay, or, and they have to make sure that person is trained on object handling. They have to make a space available in the archive. They have to provide usually a camera or some software, or laptop, etc. So there can be a little bit of an entry barrier on that sense. So most museums are starting with their most interesting, quote unquote, collections because they think that that's what will draw people to traffic the museum website. So if you want something 3D scanned at a museum is doing it, feel free to email them and say, hey, I would really love to see the verso of this object. It would be really nice if you could add this to your scanning list, or, do you have this on your scanning list? And if so, when will it come out? Or to ask other museums, if you are, usually if you're master's level or above, not a lot of places are great about BA students without sort of a backup or from a professor or whatever. But if you're master's level or above, you can often write to a museum with proof of your enrollment and say, I would like to see this as part of my research. And they may give you permission to photograph it in a special room, etc. And you can just make the 3D model on your phone right there in the museum. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely ways to do this. But because people are right now just on the forefront of it, like just starting this project, these kinds of projects, they're doing the flashy stuff first. And I think it'll take probably another 10 years before we get all the really, all the pottery shards and everything that I'm really interested in. So what different challenges does archaeology face in terms of decolonization compared to other classical fields like literature or history, aside from questions of repatriation? So classics and philology and art history have a different history than archaeology and anthropology, which are specifically founded on racist and mostly Christian based archaeology, trying to prove the worth of Western civilization and prove the value to world cultures as opposed to the work that other cultures are doing and have done. So yeah, it was explicitly created to do things like, to support things like phrenology and things like that. And that's why you get quite a lot of early discussions about how Timbuktu must have been built by the Dutch because Black Africans could never have been advanced enough to build things like this. It's why you get things like aliens built the pyramids, but no one ever says that about Stonehenge. So there's a lot of work to be done in archaeology, as well as, because it's still quite a lot of like pith helmet and desert excavation stuff happening as far as popular media. Which is not necessarily what's happening on the ground, but it's what's being shown in media, and everything is a miraculous discovery that no one knew about except the people who lived on top of the site for the last 3,000. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of archaeology that needs to be completely rethought. And archaeology is inherently destructive. Plus there's the fact of, okay, once we excavate things, we remove them from source communities and go hide them in a repository where they might not be on display. And even if they are, source community probably doesn't have any access or probably any say in how it's displayed. So yeah, archaeology has a lot more issues in that sense than something that's strictly philological, etc. Have there ever been instances where private collectors have refused to make 3D models? If so, what was their reasoning or excuse? So part of the problem with ancient world studies is that a lot of the objects were either exported or sent to even, let's say, like other places in Europe or other places in specifically North America and Asia, where there are big collectors of this stuff, the Getty Museum being a famous one that continually has to repatriate things that it bought 100 years ago that were illegally exported from Italy, et cetera, and Greece. So once things are sold into private collections through an auction house, the auction house signs basically an NDA saying they won't say who purchased it without specific permission from the purchaser. So we lose quite a lot of objects that way. So it's much more rare for individual private collectors to even know where the object is for them to turn down making a model. Yeah, so, but generally speaking, if people want to show off their collection, they will allow 3D models to be made. If not, then, especially if they're worried about provenance, et cetera, then they will ignore all requests and won't even allow you to photograph it. So some of the major pieces that I'm looking at, I'm relying on 18th century and 19th century travelers' drawings and hoping that they did a good job, because we just can't get access to it anymore, unfortunately. And I'm using those drawings to make 3D models, which is its own fun exercise. So yeah, that didn't really answer your question, I'm sorry, but private museums might not do it if you don't have the training or if they don't have the insurance money. I mean, that's generally because you have to pick it up and lift it and move it all around, and that can be complicated. Okay, so yes, Isabel, I intend to submit my thesis hopefully in January and defend in March. And then I will have 1 year based on German law to turn my entire dissertation into a published book. So keep an eye out on this space for about 1.5 years, 2 years from now. Once I get all the photo permissions and everything, then the full models will drop. But as soon as I defend the thesis, I'm going to drop at least the building models because they're not copyrighted in any way. The statues themselves, you know, might be slightly longer, but yeah. Okay, any other questions that I missed?
I've got 1 or 2 if you have the time. I don't want to make you like, you've been fielding questions for like 20 minutes now. So
yeah, that's fine. I'm glad that people are interested.
Yeah, actually one's just come through from Charlotte. So maybe if you address that, and I can just pass a final question to you, and then we can wrap up at 7, hopefully.
Okay. A while ago, I read a non-academic article about the destruction of non-white features, especially noses, of Egyptian statues and mummies by early archaeologists. Was this the case, and is there any academic literature on this? So there are rumors, of course, about the nose of the Sphinx being changed. There are nonsense rumors about Napoleon's troops shooting the nose off the Sphinx, which is absolutely false. There are, efforts to describe Egyptian faces in wider terms than their sort of Sudanese and Meroitic counterparts. As far as I'm aware, early archaeologists aren't actively destroying what are images of mummies' noses. In general, mummies, so a lot of the time what they did was they would have like public unwrappings of mummies. So any soft tissue that would have still been attached would have been destroyed anyway. But in general, until you reach, and even now it's still like sort of pseudoscience, until you reach the point where we're doing like micro measurements of faces to do facial reconstructions, it's really difficult to tell the race of a person just from the nasal cavity that's left behind. So yeah, it's complicated. But generally speaking, I would say it's not something that has a long history of happening to my knowledge. There, like I said, there's a lot of like sort of Egyptians get part of this classical history of like, first came Egypt, and Egypt then passed the baton of culture to Greece, and then Greece passed it to Rome, and Rome passed it to, in these narratives in English, it's usually the UK and then the US, depending on where you are, but it's also been, you know, sort of Napoleon, it's also been Prussia and Germany, etc. So they're like the way that people who are interested in Western civilization as a concept teach it is like, okay, well, we took all the good stuff and then made it a lot better. And that's, you know, and each culture builds on the next one instead of there being like, you know, sort of back and forth exchanges and lots of people doing lots of interesting things around the same time, just in a different way, etc. So yeah, I mean, there's sort of an effort by the classical civ folks to keep that sort of through line of Egypt is white adjacent in that way. But as far as I'm aware, they're not actively destroying art that way. Nefertiti's bust is a whole hornet's nest, let's say. There's a discussion around whether this is meant to be the final bust. Some people say the nose was altered. There's a lot of evidence that it was not altered. Some people say that it was meant to be someone else first and that it got altered in ancient times, etc. So the Nefertiti's bust is one of those complicated things. Everybody who publishes on it tries to publish something completely innovative and new, but it's, you know, it's been that way for like 200 years now, which means that there are a lot of conflicting arguments about it, most of which don't hold up, like wouldn't hold up in a court of law, which is not exactly a great way of explaining it. But basically, there are several different versions of the bust. The version that's in Germany is not so noticeably different than the versions that are still in Egypt, etc., that I would think that someone has been hacking at the nose. But there is an argument to be made that it was so popular in Europe because the nose is the way that it is, which is its own sort of that thing.
Amazing. I think that's probably the questions. I mean, I think we've probably you've answered across a huge range of questions, so I'm super impressed. And yeah, huge thanks from everybody, because yeah, that was a super interesting talk, and we really, really appreciate your time and sharing your research. It sounds like everyone's really interested to read your book when it comes out. So good luck with that. Gosh. And thank you also for, you know, being out there for us. I mean, we're very focused on trying to create a network of BIPOC scholars in classics and from students upwards, and you know, it's great to know that you're out there fighting the fight in the same way that we are as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me. And I dropped my Twitter in the chat if anybody wants to contact me directly with further questions. If you weren't comfortable asking in public or whatever, you just want to have a little chat, feel free to find me on Twitter.
And yeah, and a quick plug for us. I think Asia's already posted our link tree, but yeah, we do accept donations because we run entirely on our own steam, and we would like to, you know, be able to, for example, pay speakers like Bet who give their time to us and their energy and resources. So yeah, welcoming donations as well. The link is in the chat. But yeah, thanks very much for coming, guys, and hope to see a lot of you again soon. Thanks, Pat.
Bye. Thank you. I guess we can. Should we stop recording?